More than 2,000 years ago, a young Jewish teacher or a rabbi wandered out of the desert and into the north of a scrap of country called Israel. And just as a rabbi, a teacher does, he started teaching. We often hear about Jesus of Nazareth as a teacher. And that makes lots of us think about words. Teaching is so often we think about words. And there's a truth in that. I love words. My job is about words. I'm talking to you with words that I have collected together and written down and now communicate. I spend almost all of my time with words. In the face of what we have had to deal with over the last months and years, in the face of the pandemic, in the face of now a horrific war, in the face of climate change, there's so many words that are generated. And then amongst all these thousands, millions of words, there are questions. Quite rightly, questions about how these words match up with actions, about how certain people, whether they're in power or not, how their words fit with how they act. And that might be individuals or organizations or even states and countries. We get to know today about the life of this first century rabbi, Jesus of Nazareth, because of words. Words that were collected and then written down in this collection of books that we call the Bible. Words that were written, the ones about Jesus of Nazareth, about maybe 30 or 40 years after his time wandering and using these words. So around about maybe AD 60 if you want a date to pin around. And these words are collected from people who actually spent time with him. And of the four accounts we have, the one we're looking at is called Luke. And he introduces Jesus as a man of words. But not just that, because right from the start of Luke's story, his story is not about just words. This is about action, about what we call deeds. This Jesus of Nazareth is a man who doesn't just talk, but who acts, who seems to actually live out his words. Actually, a man who practices what he preaches, who is smoking what he's selling, to use a turn of phrase. In chapter 9 of Luke's account, Luke's collection, Jesus calls together the 12 young men, known as disciples, they're students, they're learners. Men he's invited to spend time with him, to learn. And now their story changes. Because now he says he's giving them power and authority not just to speak, but to act. He includes driving out demons, curing diseases. In fact, Luke's stories about Jesus so far have been all about good news. That's the word gospel. Good news for particular groups of people, the poor, the oppressed, those in prison, those who are suffering at the hands of others. It's about getting rid of what gets in the way of these people, God's people, living the lives they were made for. And Jesus has announced this as good news. And he's not just announced that, he's acted. He has healed the sick. He's got rid of evil forces that have been keeping people excluded from being part of the life they were made for. He's even dealt with death itself. And so now he challenges and invites his 12 young learners to move from watching and listening to now speaking and doing. He's sending them out to tell people about a project. The code word for that in his language is the kingdom. It means life the way God intended, where things work the way that God has made, where God is, if you like, in charge of what's going on. And Jesus wants them to go and tell people about the kingdom, what God is doing, how things can be when God is at work. But he doesn't want them just to use words. He challenges them to act, to be part of that project that the kingdom is, to be part of putting the creation project back together. In other words, to do what Jesus has been doing, like the best leaders, like the real leaders. Jesus is not asking them to do anything that he isn't already doing himself. And what he has been doing, he says, is putting on show what God is all about and has always been doing. And that's the bigger story of this collection of books we call the Bible. This story of human history about God's people and the God and the creation and the project. Jesus has been announcing not something new, actually, but that this story's way of describing what God works is showing that God has always been involved in getting rid of what gets in the way. And so, barriers are taken away and the sick are healed. Jesus tells his 12 young disciples to travel light, to rely on hospitality, to not be picky, and when they go into a village and stay in a house, not to look around for a better house to stay in while they're there, but just to stay there. He's telling them to get involved in the lives of the communities they're going to go to, which again is what God has done, we're told in these stories. That in Jesus, somehow God became flesh. He moved into the village, he moved into the neighbourhood. That's what the life and death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth is all about. And in his advice, his guidance to his 12 young learners, Jesus recognises that this will not all be plain sailing. There will be opposition. That's the reality of this broken world. There's a potential within human beings to be free to ignore God's invitation, to end up working against the way God made things, to be sucked into the ways of things like the empire, destructive forces that threaten what God's doing. But what Jesus says to them is that's a reality. There will be opposition. And in that case, these disciples are not to force themselves on communities or households or waste their time and energy where it's not going to be fruitful. Instead, they are to shake the dust off their shoes and move on. Now, shaking the dust off your shoes, that's a habit that ancient Near East Jewish folk had when they would come from non-Jewish, they called it Gentile areas. They would shake the dust of those areas off their shoes. It's an ancient truth in all sorts of cultures, probably repeated most for us recently by the poet or the theologian from North America that we know as Taylor Swift. On the subject of resistance to what God is doing, on opposition, Luke, as an artist, crafting this material together, then includes something about the puppet king of the time, calling himself King of the Jews, Herod. All Herod, we're told, was interested in was actually power and riches and pleasing the Romans and looking after himself, not interested in the Jewish project at all. And so for him, any potential rebel, any leader, anyone talking about a kingdom or suggestion that people should resist what the Romans are all about was a threat. And so we see that as Herod hears more about Jesus of Nazareth, his concern, his sense of threat increases, and he starts to think about the things people have said about Jesus, whether he was John the Baptizer, who is supposed to be dead, come back, whether he's Elijah, one of their great prophets of the Jews, or one of the other prophets. But Herod then thinks again about the fact he'd already had John the Baptizer killed, so that shouldn't be a problem, but he's still worried, he's still paranoid. And his question rings out, and Luke includes it on purpose. Who is this that I hear such things about? Who is this? Who is this Jesus that I hear such things about? If Luke was writing a big song, this would be his theme, this would be his chorus that it comes back to. Who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? And he puts the words into Herod's mouth at this point. I'd like to think that when we here in Banchory, in Scotland, get involved in God's project, and in our community are not just speaking but acting, that people are asking, who is this Jesus that we keep hearing about? People are hearing about Jesus, in this case, not just because of what he and his followers are saying, but because of what they're doing. And so Luke moves straight on to a story about a huge crowd of people, 5,000 men and all those who would be with them, who need to be fed. And then when these 12 young men say, well, let's just send them to the local villages to buy food, he challenges them. He says, you give them something to eat. You respond. They don't think it's possible. They come up with excuses, they explain the reasons, but in the face of all that, Jesus ignores that and he remains calm. He gives them some simple instructions, break things down, and they respond and they follow his instructions, and there, again, God is at work. Everyone is fed, and more than that, there are 12 baskets of food left over. On the one hand, it seems a simple story about the fact that this is what God does. That in God's kingdom project, the hungry are satisfied and there are leftovers. This is about abundance. But note this, in this crowd are all sorts of people. Jews, non-Jews, insiders, outsiders, sinners, good, bad, and all the rest. And yet all are fed. All are satisfied and there's more left over. Again, this is Luke including that for him this God project is about abundance, it's about generosity, it's about including far more of God's children than anyone has ever realised, whether they deserve it or not. There's more layers to what Luke is trying to express. And as much as this story is about a miracle of God's power, of what God does, at its heart, it's a story of trust. When Jesus challenged his young followers to go out, he said to them, travel light, accept hospitality. And that meant they had to trust. Not trust in their savings, not trust in what they packed, not trust in the money they carried or the travel insurance they bought, but to trust in this project, to trust in this man, to trust in their God. The God of abundance, the God of generosity, the God of healing, the God who puts things back together in Jesus of Nazareth, in his God and his words and his actions. And in these stories, time and time again, God is always at work. God's project can be trusted even when it seems all the odds are against it. And time again, as God's people, we are invited, challenged to respond, to play our part, to trust in God's project, even when the seemingly impossible faces us, and to respond not just with words, but with our actions, our trust, our faith, our lives.